Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is David Feinstein, and I'm the literacy educator at the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art in Amherst, Massachusetts. It is so good to have you with us this evening. As folks are joining, please feel free to use the chat feature in Zoom to introduce yourself. You can let us know who you are, where you're joining from, or share a recent picture book that you've shared with a loved one. We'll be talking a lot about those moments that we've shared with loved ones, friends, and family with books this evening. So hopefully everyone can get in the chat. Attendees can chat with everyone. Yes. We'll give everyone a few more minutes to join in. But again, oh, hello, Shelley. Great to see your name there. Wow, we've got folks joining from all over the country. Ready, Set, Read in LA. Hi, Naomi. Wow. Great to have all of you with us from near and far this evening. So this chat is where you can share your comments, your questions, your thoughts throughout the evening. We're really excited to have this be a conversation and to get your thoughts and ideas as we move through the evening. Wow, we've got folks from overseas too, from Australia, Montreal. Welcome, everyone. So again, it's so great to have everyone's names and conversation happening in the chat. This chat feature is also where we'll be sharing some links throughout the program to resources, things that we'll be discussing throughout the course of the program. And again, we would love to hear any questions that you may have for Megan and our incredible group of panelists this evening. So feel free to type those questions into the chat at any time, and we'll get to them a little bit later in our program. We are so excited to welcome Megan Dowd Lambert. Hi, Megan, to discuss her brand new essay collection. This book is so beautiful. It's so great to finally be able to hold it. Book Bonding, Building Connections Through Family Reading, just out from Charlesbridge. If you've yet to get your hands on this book, you can order a copy from the Carle and receive a signed copy. So Megan wears many hats in the field of children's literature. She is an award-winning author, most recently of a new 7-book early reader series, Every Day with April and May. She's a reader, a reviewer, an educator, formerly at the Carle, where she developed the whole book approach to story time, and as a lecturer at Simmons University. And she is now the co-owner and president of the publishing company, Modern Memoirs, Inc. And of course, last but not least, she's the mother of 7 children. Welcome, Megan. So good to have you with us. Also joining this evening it's Megan and friends. All of us are friends here. Joining us this evening is Elissa Gershowitz, the editor-in-chief of The Horn Book. Hi, Elissa, one of the most distinguished resources in the field of children's and young adult literature, and where several of the essays that are featured in the book originally appeared. So welcome, Elissa. Also with us tonight are Melissa Giraud and Andrew Grant-Thomas, the co-founders of EmbraceRace, a national nonprofit that supports adults to raise children who are thoughtful, informed, and brave about race, and with whom Megan collaborated quite a bit during the writing of this book. Welcome, Melissa and Andrew. And we'll have a chance to talk more with all of our panelists throughout the evening. But first, I'm going to pass it over to Megan to get things started, read from the book, and get us thinking about some book bonding moments from our own lives. Megan, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And thank you to Elissa and Melissa and Andrew, and to all of you who are joining us this evening. This book has been in progress for a long time. I wrote one of the very first essays that I ever wrote for the Horn book back in 2008. That appears in this book now. And at the time, I was really thinking about writing one book that would be for teachers, librarians, parents, other caregivers, everybody all together. But what I discovered through some helpful editorial work with others is that really I needed to write 2 books, and it turned out 3. So the first book I wrote was this one, Reading Picture Books with Children, How to Shake Up Story Time and Get Kids Talking About What They See. And this book was published by Charlesbridge in 2015. It introduced the whole book approach that I developed in association with the Carle. But I still had all of this other material. That first book was more for teachers and librarians, but I still had all this other material gleaned from my reading life, not at the Carle or in story times when I visited schools, but when I was reading with my children at home. And I wanted to document those moments, not only as a way of kind of showing my love for my own kids and creating this book as really a love letter to them and all that I've learned from reading with them, but I also wanted to share it as a way of saying to other parents and caregivers out there, like, you too can have these book conversations, and you already are having these book conversations. And so what I want to invite all of you to do who are there is just to use the chat or use a piece of paper and just start to jot down some books that immediately come to mind that have sparked conversations or in other ways helped you to bond with young readers in your life. Maybe there's a book that sits on your shelf and it doesn't only hold words and pictures and stories, but it holds memories. I would bet there are many such books on your shelves. So I invite you to go right ahead and type in the chat box. And I'm going to read just a little bit about the purpose of this book. And I'm going to read from the preface of my new essay collection. And part of what I'm thinking about with book bonding is I'm thinking about how we bridge distance between ourselves as parents and our children. And maybe that difference is merely generational in the context of your own family, but maybe you're bridging a distance across gender or across race or across other elements of identity. That's true in my family. And so what I try to explore and hold up throughout this book is all the different ways that my kids and I have met each other as individuals with certain strengths and challenges and life experiences. And the books are a meeting place really for us to speak with one another, to learn about one another, and to learn from one another. So here's what I say in my preface. So how do I best bridge the distance that exists between my children and me, while I recognize and celebrate that they are their own human beings and not mine? And that's a reference to a song I quote earlier, recorded by Sweet Honey in the Rock. It's an adaptation of Khalil Gibran's poem on children. How can other parents and caregivers do so too? My multiracial, adoptive, queer, blended family life affirms that familial bonds are rooted not only in biology, but in legal measures, choices, and above all, in shared experiences and love. This is where book bonding comes in. I coined this phrase during my time as an educator at the Eric Carle Museum of Picture Book Art in Western Massachusetts. It highlights the social and emotional impact of shared reading in classrooms and libraries, but at home too. It's a happy truth that my work as an author, educator, and children's literature scholar is deeply enriched by my life as a mother. The books on my family's bookshelves hold not just words and pictures, but also memories of time spent together and of moments when reading and talking about reading have helped us better understand each other. In other words, books have helped us bond. And I go on in the essay collection to explore lots of different themes that are generated through that book bonding, themes that I trace through my family's reading life, themes that I find in the books themselves. And so I think before I turn things over to our panel who've read my book, and we had a great conversation leading up to this, and I'm so pleased and honored that they're here and interested in engaging with me around it. But before I turn things over to them, I just want to show you a few photos so that you can have a little more context for who we people are that we'll be talking about. All right, I'm going to skip that part. Okay, so so here again is the whole book approach book that I wrote first. And what I am inspired by there is this idea that comes from Louise Rosenblatt and her transactional reader response, that books do not simply happen to people, people also happen to books. And if we believe that, then we can consider that meaning doesn't reside within the book or within the reader, the adult, or the kids even. It pings around in the space between us. And if that's true, which I believe it is, then what I want to do is try to have reading that is a book discussion, where I'm reading with children as opposed to reading to them, so that I can really invite their book happenings to enrich our conversations, and I can empower them to be strong, independent readers. I'm going to skip over some content here because, as I said, that first book, introducing the whole book approach, was about giving that approach to teachers and librarians. Certainly parents and other caregivers can use it too, but it's more a professional development book. But here I'm delving more into what happens when you have those conversations and you're not only talking about art and design and text, you're also talking about yourself, and you're talking about each other, and you're talking about politics, and you're talking about humanity. And the themes that kept bubbling up for me in my essays were about parenting, thinking about my own parenting and how books and book bonding helped me as a parent, thinking about adoption, because some of our children came home to our family through adoption, thinking about race, because ours is a multiracial family and there's no way I can bond with my children, any of them, unless we have honest conversations about race, and about healing. And the healing emerges from all sorts of places in the context of our lives, but I think we can all relate to a time when a book has helped us through something, or maybe helped us help someone else through something. So these are some of my kids. These are my first 5 children, and there we all are together reading The Night Before Christmas. This is my first baby, Rory. You can see me reading with him when he was just a little guy, and then here he is slightly older. And there's Amelia, my first daughter. And now Rory is bonding with us by reading with us and reading aloud. Oops. And then I'm reading with Amelia, and Amelia carries on that reading aloud to baby Caroline. You'll see, though, that Amelia is a toddler here, and she's chosen a novel. I know you can't read it on the screen, but the novel is Summer of My German Soldier. She's not actually reading Summer of My German Soldier. Instead, what she's doing is just sharing the experience of reading with Caroline. She was probably talking about mommies and babies and puppies or whatever. This is Natasha, who came home to our family when she was 8. And one of the first things that made her feel at home was finding a book on a shelf that she recognized. And that book was The Cat in the Hat. And so there she is reading The Cat in the Hat in my reading chair from when I was a little girl. There's Stevie at the Carle, actually, and you can see his kind of book bonding is often a playful one, or was when he was a little guy, and he's 18 now, and I continue to have some of my best book conversations with him. There's Rory, all grown up, reading with Jessie, and then Jessie and Zach with some spectacular pandemic era bedhead reading together and book bonding in our living room. This is all of us today in my house. Some of my kids have another house with their other mom and her partner and his kids. So ours is a really big family, and yet we all are readers to some extent or another. Not everyone's an avid reader, and I want to be clear about that. But we all have bonded with one another through books, not just parent-child, but siblings as well. And I hope that in the ensuing discussion, we're going to be able to get to some specifics. And I also absolutely want to welcome your own book bonding stories as well. So I'm going to stop my share and just note that we've already got someone talking about 29-year-old son when this mother thinks back to him, you know, she says that I can still recite every word of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, Time for Bed, and several others. Every time I see one of these books, I see my 2-year-old reading this book to me. Thank you. So now I'll turn things over to Elissa, who, as you heard in the introduction, she is the editor at the Hornbook. And before that, I worked with Elissa on many of these pieces. She was my editor to help develop these essays for the Hornbook before they ended up here in this book. So Elissa, thanks again for being here. And what do you want to talk about?
Thank you, Megan. That was great. Hi, everybody. I'm Elissa Gershowitz, editor-in-chief of the Hornbook. For those who don't know, the Hornbook magazine is a children's book review journal based in Boston for almost 100 years, because next year is our centennial. Here's our most recent May-June issue on the theme Diverse Books, Past, Present, and Future, with the gorgeous cover art by Brian Collier. And
I have to say, this edition, and I posted it online too, this is spectacular. It's so good. Everyone should go out and get a copy. They're at the Carle.
Oh, good. Yes,
Yeah.
they'll also be at the American Library Association conference.
Oh, yes.
If anyone will be there. So yes, as you said, several of the articles in Book Bonding were originally published in the magazine or on our family reading or Calling Caldecott blogs. Megan said we worked on many of these pieces together, and I have such a strong connection to many of them, but especially to the first piece in your book, which is called Words for Flora's Mother, parentheses, and Other Imperfect Parents. And now is the time when I give my standard caveat that if you see my mute, quickly go on. It's likely because children are yelling at each other upstairs, or perhaps the impromptu recorder concert that started a few minutes ago is done with its intermission. But, along to follow that theme, my first question is, why was it important for you to start this book with this particular piece? My bigger picture question is, how did you go about deciding which pieces to include in the book? But let's start at the beginning with the first piece.
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. So yeah, this essay is about times when maybe reading aloud didn't go as well, or maybe I was faltering as a parent in other ways, and reading was what helped me get back to my kids. And I wanted to start that way because I don't want anyone to read this book and walk away thinking like, oh, she's got it totally together and everyone's always reading and happy and everything's great, because clearly that's definitely not true in anyone's house and definitely not in mine. And so I wanted to kind of take myself off any kind of pedestal that might be out there because I published a book, and just say, I'm in this with all of you parents and caregivers who are just every day trying to do the best we can by our kids. And that includes shared reading in my house, that I don't know what I would do without shared reading, because so many times we're having, a chaotic day at home, and then book time comes at the end. And that's when I can settle myself. And that's when I can connect with my kids. And so here's what I say in that essay. Sorry, got to put my glasses back on. All right. So I'm quoting Kate DiCamillo's novel and referencing it, Flora and Ulysses. And I say, DiCamillo's novel avoids having the final words delivered in a parental voice begging filial pardon. Instead, the closing poem is the superhero squirrel's affirmation of his devotion to the girl who saved him. Adoptive parents like me frequently encounter well-intentioned but misguided comments implying that we saved our kids. They're so lucky to have you, is the refrain, belying the core losses that premise adoption. The truism that my kid's other mom and I often resort to is that we are the lucky ones, since our children accepted us as parents. Nothing would be harder to imagine than life without them. Paraphrasing DiCamillo, it's a miracle or something. And if I ever lose sight of the miracle of this modern family of mine, there's nothing like settling in with a book. It helps redirect my family's attention away from the tumult of our own foibles and failings toward the common ground of others' stories. Book bonding, I call it. We put aside quarrels over who had more time on the Xbox, why it's so hard to bring the freaking laundry downstairs, and whatever is not fair at a given moment. Together we read about everything from very windy days to bunny exchanging daddies to mothers driven wild to superhero squirrels. And holy bagumba, as Flora might say, we create book bonds. And I'll love those times forever, to the moon and back. The kitchen floor can wait. And that's that.
Thank you. I put myself on mute because I was typing more questions as
Oh, sure. No.
that they came up as you were talking. So I have a few different threads. I'm just going to go in one direction. What you said in the preface is so hard to do. To think of your children, especially when they're very small, to think of your children as not yours, and as they grow and as they develop their own interests, tastes, abilities, likes, dislikes, all whatever it may be, reading included. How did you come to that conclusion? Well, I guess I could not. How did you come to the conclusion? How do you put that into practice? It's not easy.
No, it's not easy at all. But I have to say, I'm reading this book now, which I recommend to any adoptive parent. It's called You Should Be Grateful: Stories of Race, Identity, and Transracial Adoption, by Angela Tucker, who is brilliant. I followed her for years, and this is her new book. And she opens it with that Khalil Gibran poem. And when I saw that, I was like, I do. And it felt like affirming and exciting, and like, oh, I really do believe this. And I'm getting this reinforcement from this other book. And the reason I think it's so important, or it kind of bubbled up for me, is that some of my kids were born to me, and others of my kids came home to our family through adoption. And I never, ever, ever want any of them to feel like someone is more my kid than the others. And the way I think about it is that it ends up liberating my bio kids to say, okay, we're not going to talk about mine. We're going to talk about you as individuals, all of you, all 7, that you are your own people. And my job as mom is to help you be the best version of yourself, to give you the opportunities and the love and the confidence to go out in the world. And books are a great tool in all of that, right? Now, do I get it right all the time? Absolutely not. The line in my family that's been circulating recently is that mum, which is what my kids call me, has no chill when it comes to her children, which is true. I have no chill. I am not the mom standing back and just like, oh, off they go. How lovely. I'm taking, dozens of photographs and having my kids kind of give me the side eye, like, don't clap so loud. Or being told when I go to my daughter's soccer game, you can watch, but you may not cheer my name, because some of my kids are, a lot more reserved than I am. And I have to respect that. But what I found again and again and again and again is that reading with my kids is one of the surest ways to reinforce this notion that my kids are their own people, because of Louise Rosenblatt's idea that we can read the same book and have wildly different responses to them, to that book. And if I take the time to listen to my kids, I get to know them better. And that's all I want. Like, I want relationship with my kids at all their different stages of life. And books help us create that. And they help us create it in a way that's reciprocal, as opposed to, top down.
What do you see as sort of the biggest barriers to entry to this sort of approach for people who either don't think that they're readers, or don't think that their kids are readers? The kids don't think they're readers. The parents don't think they're readers. They may not have access. They haven't had a good experience with books. They might be apathetic. They haven't found the right book. How do we get them? How do we suck them in?
Oh, well, now I'm going to put on my Eric Carle Museum hat, because what I found again and again when I was leading story time at the Carle is that I would have parents say, I can't believe he sat there for a half an hour while you were reading. Like, wow, he'll never sit still and read with me. And I'll say, well, that's because he wasn't just sitting, right? That it's not about sit still, listen, be quiet. If you embrace this kind of back and forth approach, it's about, I really care about your ideas, and let's talk about them. And let's, maybe we don't have time to finish this book because we've been talking about it so much. So we'll set it aside because we've got to, go to piano practice or whatever it is. We can come back to it. That's one thing I always say, is you can always stick a bookmark in a picture book. Don't feel like you just have to get through it, because there's a big difference between reading a book and finishing a book, right? And my thought is that if you're reading a book, you're really engaging with it. And maybe other barriers might be feeling a great sense of fidelity to text, that you have to read every single word, right? Or sometimes children will enforce that, right? Like the child who loves the book and they're like, you skipped a page or you missed a sentence, right? And so then I can say, well, if you're reading picture books, you can also have these incredibly rich conversations about art. I'll just do a tiny little commercial. I mentioned a third book I had to write, and it's this one that I just published at my own company, which has 70 whole book approach plans for 70 different picture books. And it has questions and extension activities and that sort of thing, because that's what I kept getting asked for again and again when I did professional development projects or programs was, well, how do I do this? And part of that, I think, is just anxiety, because I'm like, well, you just read the book and you talk about it, right? But people want more of kind of a menu of questions that they could draw upon. And so I've tried to provide that. But my biggest message, I think, is let the kid just take it away. And if you start asking open-ended questions, I think that's key, because then hopefully the children you're reading with won't feel like you have to get a right answer. They'll feel like you're interested in what they have to say.
Yeah. Can you talk about the art in your own book, in bookbonding? Because it's
thank you so much. I'm so glad you asked. So this is the artist's name is Maya Sain, and they are an artist who've done lots of different work. They were an artist who was chosen by Target to do some of their holiday like wrapping paper and gifts last year. I remember walking into Target and I didn't know that, and there was this huge display, and I was like, oh, that's Maya, that's Maya's work, and it sure enough was. And what I love about what Maya did is that, you know, this isn't my family on the cover. It's, you know, sort of kind of like my family with a white appearing mom and then 4 kids of color. But as I said, I have 7 kids, right? And these kids and their races and ages don't quite match us. And that's great, because I don't want this to be like, oh, this is my autobiography, right? And everyone wants to know about me and my children. I want it to just be kind of like, this is a family and their reading life, and I want it to feel like a conversation, like an invitation for people to engage with books in this really open-ended way. And so Maya's art, I think, communicates a kind of cozy feeling, even just the little trim size of the book. It's such a tiny little book and you can just pop it in your bag. And they didn't just do the cover art. There are also these wonderful little spot illustrations at all of the chapter headings, which I love, because so many of the books I grew up with had that little kind of spot art. And then they are also separating the 4 parts of the book. There are these big full color spreads that show people reading in different contexts, which I think is important, because book bonding, of course, doesn't just happen at home at night when you're reading a bedtime book. It can also happen in other contexts, whether you're at the library or at a restaurant or wherever. For years, and still really, I always have books in my bag because they help us get through, you know, waiting at a restaurant or whatever. And I'm sure lots and lots of other parents and caregivers do that too. Oh, and I love seeing the chat is filling up with people's book bonding memories. This is wonderful. 10 Little Fingers and 10 Little Toes. Oh, I love that book.
Right in the other room.
Yeah. Oh, I love that book. I love that book. I remember reading that with kids at story time at the Carle, and then my own kids too.
Yeah. Well, I'll pass the conversation to continue to Melissa and Andrew.
All right. Thank you, Elissa. And thank you so much for all your editorial help too, because boy, are those pieces better because of you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. We're so honored to be in this conversation. Megan has meant so much to us as a friend, and also as someone who's taught us a lot about books and about talking to kids about books. And
if you don't know it, Megan rules, y'all.
Yeah, Megan's amazing. And I think that one of the big, I think one thing that I see a lot of people, so we founded this organization called EmbraceRace, and a lot of folks come to us not knowing, as you know, Megan, not knowing, just being hesitant around books. And I think being hesitant to have real sort of conversations the way they would around something that happened in life or around a movie even. And that was one of the important lessons, I think, Megan, that you taught us, was that reading books is reading the world. And so they're a tool in a way. I mean, they're also a joy and a bonding, but they're a tool in a way if you use the tool, if you take advantage of the conversation. And we've certainly been guilty of, like, with picture books especially, not looking at the pictures as much as the kids, or rushing through the word, or feeling like you have to get to the end. So I love all of the points you're making, and it reminds me of all the ways that we've grown as readers, in large part because of Megan. So I wanted to talk a bit about your essay that was one of the first ones that I read of yours, that was in the Horn book, called Reading About Family in My Family. Because I think that is an experience that a lot of parents, and you can tell us the story of it, a lot of parents have that come to us, and that we certainly have, is we think a lot about, especially if your kids are of marginalized identities, like how, or your family is, where are they in the books, and are there enough books? And of course, that's all really important stuff to think about, but this essay kind of opened up some new ideas for me.
Yeah. So in that piece, what I'm trying to write about is how, when I had one child, I often say it was harder to have one child than 7, because I could micromanage him, and I tried and failed. And one thing that I was so earnest about was just trying to find books that looked like his family. And in the 90s and like the early part of this century, finding books about multiracial queer families was very hard, let me tell you. But we tried, and I found that Rory was just kind of not interested. And I realized, like, okay, this is me and my preoccupation visiting it upon him. Now, that doesn't mean I think representation doesn't matter. It absolutely matters to kids. But what I found was that the more I made a big deal of it in Rory's life, the more he resisted it. And the more I realized, okay, I need to back off and just model books as a place where we can search for ideas and search for inspiration. And when we come up short, we can be loud about that coming up short. And at the same time, when I did find books that resonated with representations of our family in some way, I wanted them to be part of his life, and I wanted him to feel embraced by them. And so I'll read just a little bit of that essay that I flagged. So this is what I said. I had the good intention of wanting to provide my son with a literary world that reflected the life experiences we shared as a multiracial 2-mom family in a diverse community of friends and neighbors. But while my son was included in that world, he had a world of his own devising. He was growing up and developing his own identity, making his own friends, following his own passions, tastes, and interests, and formulating his own visions for his future. After all, my son's world, occupied as it was with the stuff of preschool, was also one in which he imagined the adult he would become. Once, while reading Homemade Love by Bell Hooks and Shane W. Evans, Rory said something along the lines of, I like reading this book about a family with all brown people like me, because maybe someday I will grow up and have a family like that too. Eureka. I exhaled alongside overburdened Heather and her 2 mommies and the black and brown is tan family, and I realized that Rory had a point. Reading children's books isn't all about looking at the here and now, in other words, his current context with his 2 white moms. It was also about envisioning the up ahead and later. And Rory, I mean, all my kids have helped me see that again and again. And in the context of my family life, what I try to talk to people about is that I didn't feel that as rejection. It wasn't that Rory was like, I don't like having 2 white moms. He was imagining, maybe one day I will be in a family and my partner will be brown and our kids will be brown, and wouldn't that be awesome? And it would be awesome, because it's not about ranking, it's about what his vision is. So I think it kind of circles back to what we were talking about before about your children are not your children, right? That trying to see Rory as separate from me and as, you know, a person who I love and adore and want to help become the best that he can be and the life that he chooses and he wants for himself.
You know, one of the things I just love about your approach to reading, and I feel one of the things you're trying to teach us, or certainly demonstrate for us, is, you know, not only that our kids aren't ours, but they are actually fully realized people. right? So
Yes.
they're not, obviously they're evolving rapidly, they will become adults. I mean, their developmental changes, all those sorts of things, but they are fully realized people right now who have ideas that we may not be familiar with. And, to pick up on something Melissa said in the lead into her question, we do tend, or it's easy for adults to be dismissive of
Yes.
picture books, for example, right? Thinking of them as sort of simple and perhaps even simple-minded
Not
products.
Andrew, though.
To think of kids, right, as sort of, simple, they can't. And what you're suggesting is, in both cases, actually, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot going on that you might be
Absolutely.
familiar with. I wanted to pull back just a moment, though, and ask, it's clear that, book bonding, one of the stakes is the possibility of, as you say, getting to know your child better, right? How, they think and so on. But I wonder, it seemed to me that even outside of that actually really exciting possibility, there's a lot for the adult to gain, even outside of the engagement with the child, right? So just, you take the idea that books are socially constructed, right? There's a very deliberate set of decisions made so seriously. And I tell you, I mean, it wasn't until we started doing EmbraceRace work and, learning a bit about, for example, the picture book industry, that I certainly came to appreciate that it's so competitive.
Yes.
Right? Like the amount of sort of artistry that goes into getting a book published by, there's so many great books that aren't published, will never be published.
Yes.
I wonder if you could say a little something to, all the folks listening or adults about what they may gain, in addition to engaging with a child they love, from thinking seriously, adopting the whole book approach to their reading with.
Yeah. Well, I think the main thing that I get outside of, this important focus of bonding with kids and getting to know my kids is that I get these opportunities for moments where I can say, I never thought of it that way. Like those aha moments where I can be very humbled, right? When I totally miss something that's in a book and a child shares it with me, or a repeat reading finally allows me to see it. And I value that for myself. I love that feeling of having something that I thought challenged and expanded, because then I can either go back to what I did think and find good evidence for why what I originally thought was so or is so, or I get to revise my thinking. I get to grow. I get to change. It's an invitation. And I want to model that for my kids. And I wanted to model that for kids at story time, because so often I think if we're encountered with a belief or a value or any information that challenges what we think we already know, there can be an impulse to just be defensive, like, no, that's not true because I know this, blah, blah, blah. It says so right here, right? And then we can just get at loggerheads. And that's why sometimes they say story time is a microcosm of democracy, right? Like if we all come together around this one thing and we can have a back and forth exchange around ideas and everyone gets to have some kind of say, well, then we're teaching kids how to dialogue around all kinds of issues, right? And so that's what I think grownups can get out of this, both the experience themselves of being challenged to view the world through someone else's eyes and someone else's perspective, if you do have this back and forth conversation, or even if you just engage with a book that surprises or delights or challenges you, and the opportunity to model that openness to the next generation, because we've got to do that, right?
And Megan, in reading, you talk a lot about, and that's a great example, just the eureka you get from Rory, about power in reading and the power that adults have and sort of impose, and it's really hard for us to give it up. It's really hard for us to not impose our reading, to not impose our time schedule, but the benefits of like power sharing and letting kids, as Andrew said, have power now, as opposed to like, I'm going to indoctrinate or something until you're old enough to have power. Like you can have power, you can play with power and have power in our lives and in our conversations.
Yes.
And I'm going to
Yes.
recognize that. So can you talk a little bit about how you see how you try to share power in
Sure.
funding? Yeah.
Sure. So book choice is the first thing that comes to mind, that when kids can choose their own reading material, they're going to be more engaged. Now, that doesn't mean my kids always choose what books we read together. Like I will absolutely, sometimes curate a selection and say, which of these books would you like to read, right? But we have a pretty open or totally open bookshelf policy at home. Like kids can take whatever they want off the shelf. We can read them together, not. So choice is, I think, the number one thing. But then when we are reading together, sometimes what I'll try to do is ask those open-ended questions. That's another way of sharing power, right? That I'm not saying, I want you to come to this answer, so I will ask a closed question or try to get you to say the right thing. I try to keep things really open-ended. The other thing I will do sometimes, and this is particularly my 8-year-old, Jesse, the way that he learns, he's not really down with the whole book approach. He doesn't like all the stopping, the starting, and the talking because he learns really well through his ears. So he'll sometimes be like, can't you just read the book, right? And so I say, oh, we are reading the book. We're reading the pictures. And he said, yeah, I'm doing that by myself. We'll talk about it later. And so sometimes I cede power to Jesse by saying, okay, we don't have to talk about it right now. And then we read the whole book through, and then maybe we have a conversation afterwards, or maybe it's another day. Whereas Zachary, my youngest, oh, this is like his cup of tea. He loves the back and the forth. And that's just how Rory was, just how Stevie was, and when I think about my daughters, sometimes their book choices, especially, were not my cup of tea. I did not want to read some of their choices, or, that wasn't just my daughters. I'm not much of a fantasy reader, like true confessions. And almost all of my kids love fantasy books. And so, I think there was a podcast I did with Roger Sutton at the Horn Book once where I said, I think once I just looked at my kids and said, please let me read Ramona, because I wanted to read Ramona with them. That was what I loved as a kid. And that's what I wanted to share with them. So book choice and open-ended questions and just keeping things flowing back and forth, as opposed to, like you said, Melissa, having a real agenda, like we're going to get through this. And that's not always easy because time constraints are real. I'm looking at our time right now and
know, yeah.
I want to come back to more questions from you, and then we'll go to the audience, but absolutely. Just allowing kids to feel like they have say and they have input, and respecting them as people who have good ideas and good questions too.
I love that.
Elissa, can I ask one more
question?
Yeah. So it's the essay alongside, not despite, reading West settler colonialism in children's literature. I think that's the essay in which the question, I think that's the exchange with your two youngest.
No.
Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a different one. That's
yes. This is about
loving book conversations.
No, here's sorry. No, but this is the one in which you said that you had moved around whether or not you engage, right? Whether or not there's some books that you don't want to engage with your children.
Oh, yes, that is that one. Right. Alongside, not despite. Yeah.
Alongside, not despite. And I just want to pull that up because, right, in the there is an ongoing debate, right, that at times has been very heated and probably still is, certainly in some homes, about whether or not, some of the classic books, right, that we who are in our 40s or 50s or 60s or 30s as children may have loved, and then in retrospect, right, or with the distance of many years later, or when we read them again, if we read them again, we realize, oh, actually there may be some kind of troubling features to this book. And there is, I think, a very active dispute about whether or not our approach might be, we can read all books with children, right? Or are there some books that we should just leave alone? And I think it's fair to say that, at least to some degree, right, you've moved in your own thinking toward some books I'm going to leave alone, right? Yes. I'm not going to engage. And I just wonder for our audience members who may be facing or at some point will face exactly that kind of decision. If you could explain sort of the logic of your evolution on that issue.
Sure, sure. And I think it's a really important issue to talk about today in particular, because of thinking about book bans and challenges that are happening in libraries and schools. And I want to be very clear that when I make a decision not to read certain books in my home with my kids, I'm not making that decision for other families. I'm not saying this is what I do, therefore everybody should do that. And that's what's happening at an institutional level, when a very small group of people are challenging the right to have any books that even just acknowledge the existence of queer people, or that tell the true story or true stories of the more shameful or difficult parts of our country's history. They're saying, no, that's too upsetting. We can't possibly have anyone read them or any children read them. I don't make that decision for other people. I make it in my family, and I don't think anyone should make that decision in public libraries, except the librarians themselves who are curating those shelves in the service of their patrons. And so in one essay, Alongside Not Despite, I write about how with my first 5 kids, I read aloud. We read Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I grew up on the Wilder series and the show. I, wore my hair in braids. My top bunk was The Loft. And I loved those books and I wanted to read them with my kids. And I knew enough about the history to know that there was a, whitewashing of the impact of settler colonialism in the first book. I wouldn't even say that, though. There was a myth in the first book. It opens with the lines that there were no people in the big woods of Wisconsin, except for the Ingalls, for miles around. And we know that's not true, right? And so when I read the book with my first 5 kids, we pointed that out, right? Like, oh, that is not true. And we had that kind of critical discussion. But with my kids, we'd already talked about that untruth when we talked about Thanksgiving, or when we talked about lots of different areas where topics of Native sovereignty and current Native lives came into our discussions or our personal interactions. And so it wasn't revelatory for them. It was kind of like, yeah. What was revelatory for them was the religiosity of the book, because my kids were not raised in a religious household. And so they were like, what's this? Or I remember my daughter said once, we saw a Bible once. And it was like she was saying they saw like a unicorn or an accordion or something. And that made me think, oh, I need to at least culturally give them more of a context of religion. So that's where that Little House experience went. But then I read Little House on the Prairie for the first time as an adult to teach it. I reread it, and I was so appalled by not just whitewashing, but unvarnished, horrible racism. And I thought to myself, I cannot share this book with my kids. Like, they're going to get all of those stereotypes and all of that garbage. They're going to get all of that anyway. And so why am I going to read that book to have that conversation? I trust myself to have those conversations anyway. So I set it aside. And then when Jesse and Zach came along, I felt like I didn't need to read Little House in the Big Woods either. Not when Louise Erdrich's Birch Bark House series is out there. That can give me the same kind of homey feeling of, living off the fat of the land and working together, but without engaging in a false narrative of settler colonialism. So that's the series that I'll read with Jesse and Zach when they're a little bit older and ready for a long historical fiction series. And I don't feel a need to be nostalgic and go back to Little House when so much of what I found in that rereading was so troubling. And I do wonder, folks who get up in arms about like, oh, we're letting the classics go. I wonder when the last time was that people read those books, and if they too would come to a different reading, if they considered it and thought about the harm that gets perpetuated through that false narrative in particular, or, take your pick. There's all kinds of other books out there that can perpetuate harm as well. So thank you for asking that. And I guess I haven't been watching the chat closely, David, but are there questions that have come up in the chat, or are people just really enjoying sharing books? I don't know this one, Elissa. Harry McClary from Donaldson's Dairy. Is that an Australian one?
I think it's a New Zealand.
New Zealand, okay. Oh, an Elephant and Piggy, of course. Oh, there's Lion and the Mouse.
So many great books that people are sharing in the chat and some really wonderful stories. I love hearing the particular titles, but also getting these details about how the book got used and loved and worn out, you know, on specific road trips. Yeah, a lot of beautiful anecdotes. But feel free, if people do have questions, to add those into the chat.
Yeah. Or I'm sure our panel can come up with more too.
Yeah, well, I wondered, Megan, just following up on that essay alongside Not Despite, you talked about talking to your students about Little House, right? And about their own issues with nostalgia. I wonder if you could share more of that.
Yeah, sure. So this essay really came out of a graduate course that I taught at Simmons University when I invite students to write about a favorite book from childhood and to reread it and try to compare what they recall of their childhood reading with what their response is today. And it's an exercise. Yeah, it's an exercise not just in comparative analysis, but also in thinking about memory and how slippery memory can be and what do you really remember of your childhood reading. And I have had some people who've been able to document their childhood reading, like with a book report or a diary entry or something, and that's fabulous. But what happened again and again was every single year, someone would say, my favorite series was Little House and I feel bad about it. And I would say, you don't have to feel bad about it, but I want you, or they would say, I feel bad that I want to say I love this book despite its racism. And so in that moment of teaching, I hadn't planned this. I just said, well, instead of saying despite, say alongside, and then interrogate what that means to you. Does it mean that some of that love, some of that nostalgia starts to diminish? Maybe. Does it mean that you're going to think differently about how you use that book in a library context, in a classroom context, in a family context? Maybe. Does it mean you have to abandon those happy feelings and emotions from childhood? No, right? Like the past is the past. It happened. You had those feelings and you don't need to be ashamed of feelings, right? Feelings exist. What you do need to think about is how your book choices help create a culture of learning in your home, in your library, in your school, and what lessons are imparted through those books, and what experiences are generated. Is it an experience of contradiction, right? If a book is sharing something that's really against what you and your family feel and believe, then maybe that's an opportunity for a conversation, but maybe you don't need to read a book that's going to put you in that position if there are other books that can instead reinforce an inclusive value that you have or an anti-racist value or, name it. And I think my students, when we had that discussion, they were challenged and they were hopeful. I mean, that was the best class I think I ever taught. That, not that class meeting, but that whole class that semester. It was fall of 2016. So, our country was in political turmoil. And every week I got to come together with these incredibly bright, dedicated, brilliant students who were really taking seriously their charge as future teachers and librarians and also as parents. To say it does matter what we read with our kids and how we engage with discussion around them.
Megan, one of the things that's been so interesting to me in the debates around, again, some of these old classic books that may have in particular racist sort of themes and approaches, is how many adults of young children who want to defend the books defend it in terms of their children, even young children's ability to separate the wheat from the chaff from the book, right? Like as if the children can take what's really good, the illustrations, the whatever, and leave behind and be untouched by the stuff that adults may find problematic now. And I wonder if your students in that class, I mean, in reflecting on, the discrepancy between how they regard the book now and their love for the book, right, when they were children, do they assume that as children they were able to leave behind, what was problematic, or do they think about how they may have received those messages?
I think I don't recall that any student was like, oh, kids will figure it out, right? That wasn't what I experienced with my class. What I heard more was this feeling of, but shouldn't we use the book to have the discussion? Like, this will be our opportunity. To which I said, oh, you'll have plenty of opportunities to talk about, colonialism every year at Thanksgiving, right? Or all kind at Halloween, when you explain, like, no, you can't dress up like an Indian, right, to kids. Or there will be plenty of conversations, opportunities. You don't need to read Little House on the Prairie to have that conversation. You certainly can, but you don't have to. Our culture will give you those opportunities. And then beyond that, I guess I've changed in my thinking, and probably it's because I'm parenting white kids for the first time, that I had my first 5 kids and then I had white children. And I know that I'm going to have conversations about race and resilience with my kids of color. And then I have white kids and I think, well, we've got to have talks about anti-racism too, and about the difference between pride and supremacy, right? Like, yes, be proud of yourself, be proud of your heritage, but you're not better than anybody, right? The same way that when I had sons, I thought, well, how am I going to raise, caring, thoughtful, feminist men? And I need to do that in order to live with myself and in order to have authentic bonds with my kids, have those open conversations. And books can provide that opportunity, but I don't think we need to read books that offend our sensibilities in order to have them. Yeah.
Well,
We've got a few questions in the chat that I'm starting to notice.
yeah.
There's one that says, from Rebecca, apart from content, do you ever decide not to include books in your home library because of the low quality of the writing or illustrations? And I would say no. I mean, we have I'm forever trying to get rid of books. I have one of those little free libraries at the end of my driveway, and I'm forever putting books out there, not so much because I'm sick of them or they're low quality, as because there are just too many of them. And that's a problem in my house. It's not a problem in lots of houses, right, where there are book deserts and people don't have access to any books. So I guess the answer is no. I don't worry about the quality so much as I worry about the conversations that we can have around them. Like, they're fodder for conversation more than anything, in my parenting.
Yeah, and there's I think a very relevant question that comes after that, which is someone in the chat is saying, as their kids grow older and are kind of making their decisions about what to read and when, it's harder to know what's happening in their reading lives.
Oh, sure.
How to ask questions and talk about what they're reading when we're not necessarily, familiar with those books. So how do we have those moments?
Yeah.
When there is that kind of distance that can be.
Yeah, that happens, certainly as kids get older, but it can happen when they're younger too. I mean, even with other forms of media, right? Like, I don't sit down and watch every cartoon that my kids watch by any means, because usually when they're watching their cartoons, I'm making dinner or I'm writing a book review or whatever I'm doing. And video games, I mean, I have an 18-year-old who's a big gamer, and I do not like gaming, but I have sat down with him a few times to try to play games so that I know a little bit about what's going on. And I guess it is different than having a shared reading experience in the moment. But I think continuing to just keep the door open and to show an interest in what your kids are reading and what they're watching and what they're doing, like, that becomes dinner time conversation. That becomes, what book are we going to listen to when we go on a road trip? I try and sometimes fail, or often fail, just to be reading in front of my kids, like on my own. I remember once, this is a funny story. This was years ago. I was sitting on the couch in reading, and my daughter Amelia, who's now 19, she was just a little girl, and she came into the room and she goes, "What are you doing?" And I was just sitting there reading a book, and I said, "I'm reading." And she goes, "No, you're not." And I said, "Yes, I am." And she goes, "Well, you're not going like this." And I said, "Well, that's because I just have the words in my head. I don't have to say them or whisper them." She goes, "You don't?" I was like, no. And I realized, oh, this kid never sees me reading, like, except if I'm reading aloud with her and her siblings. And it was kind of a reality check. Like, I love to read more than I love to do anything. And if my kids aren't seeing me doing that, then how are they going to think when they do that on their own that that can be shared too? So we talk about books a lot in my family, at home, you know, at the dinner table, wherever. Because it becomes, Mem Fox writes about this in Reading Magic, it becomes like a common cultural currency, or a common language for kids, when you have the same reference points, or when you can recommend a book, right? Like, I'm forever recommending books. Do my kids always take the recommendations? No, but it's okay. It's okay. They know I'm interested, and they know that I want to know about their reading lives. Is there anything else in the chat, David, as we wrap up?
I think this is, oh, well, now we've got a big one here. Let's see. I work in early childhood, the South Bronx. We find that many of our families have no books in the house at all, and reading is at the bottom of the list of important activities, if it even makes the list. We try so many different things to help them gain an understanding of the importance of books and reading. I would love any suggestions you have for anything new we can try to inspire these families to love reading.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with strength-based, right? Like, if you hear a mom picking up a kid at your preschool and she's telling him a story about something, be like, what a storyteller you are. Because reading and stories don't only come from the pages of books. Like, yes, they're important, but stories can be passed in other ways culturally, right? And stories can be shared, just, you know, picking someone up and telling them a story. Or driving the car and telling them a story. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that if it's a question of print literacy, or if it's a question of a parent with English as a second language and they feel intimidated by reading books in English, then wordless picture books are absolutely fabulous, right? That they can really flatten or level the playing field, that's the word, level the playing field, so that people with diverse reading, or with a range of reading skills, can approach a book and not feel overwhelmed by it if they're reading wordless picture books. The other thing, and I'm sure you already do this, but is making sure that books in the kids' home language are available to them. However you can make that happen, whether it's, you know, by having a classroom library that can circulate, or getting a grant or something like that. I mean, something I'm doing with my kids right now, my little kids and I are all studying French together. And so I got a bunch of books in French and we're reading them. And in doing that, my kids are seeing, like, reading in a second language is not easy. And I hope that that fosters empathy for them as native English speakers, with all of the kids in their school who are learning English as a second language. And then it also, you know, is good modeling that mommy's still trying to figure stuff out and learn stuff too. And is there anything you all would add about that question? I'm not the only one who has ideas about that, like how to bring
some great suggestions in the chat too, in terms of access to books. The Dolly Parton Imagination Library, a great way to get free books into our homes.
And PJ Library too.
PJ Library. I know First Book does a great job in the market.
Absolutely.
Making really beautiful, wonderful stories affordable.
And then links to libraries, maybe that's more for school, but they're more local. And, you know, there are so many ways to, or so many attempts to solve this problem of book deserts, but it is a real problem. And with the erosion of support for public libraries, it's an even bigger problem in some parts of our country. And so when I talk about, like, oh, my problem is I have too many books, I realize what an enormous privilege that is. And I realize it's not representative of the reality of many, many families in our country. And book swap, oh, that's what I'll say. So my kids' elementary school for years has done a book swap where people can bring in books in good condition, and every kid gets to swap. And then if kids don't have books to bring from home, I know they've gotten book donations from organizations like Reader to Reader and from publishers directly in order to do book exchanges, so that every kid, it's not so much a fair where you're going and buying a book, but they're all grouped out and kids can swap books and take books. And there is something that's really fun about the book as an object that the kids are passing around and sharing together. Yeah. Oh, and I do want to just quickly mention Shelley Isaacson highlighted a great essay from Betty Carter called Privacy Please, which I taught for years at Simmons. And it is about respecting, like, yes, this night has been all about book bonding and the conversations we can have together about books with kids. But there is also something to be said for privacy, for the child wants to read their own thing and I'm going to read my own thing. And it's almost like parallel play with toddlers, right? Like, we don't have to talk about it. You read your book, I'll read mine. And that's another way of, encouraging a love of reading and engagement with books, is saying that can be your thing too, even if I think of it as our thing primarily.
Well, I feel like this conversation, like we said it before, the time is going to fly, and we've gone over, and I feel like we could keep talking all night. I mean, when you get book lovers together, that's what we do, right? More and more questions get asked, and I think that's a really beautiful thing, is how I see a lot of your work, Megan. I mean, reading picture books with children, the new one, book bonding. These are these books. There it is. Buy it. Yeah, you can get it at the
Everybody's doing it.
But what I was gonna say is, these are books that really can stay with us, and they're books in my life as a parent, as an educator, that I can always return to and re-see. And I think of them as planting all of these new little seeds to go out and find more of these resources to continue, again, this kind of lifelong exploration of how we read and grow. So this is just another one of those resources. And I think that a lot of the questions, a lot of the resources that have been shared in the chat are these things that we can continue kind of exploring, obviously beyond tonight. So just thank you again, Megan, for this book, for tonight. And thank you so much, Elissa and Andrew and Melissa, for helping to bring these essays out into the world to begin with, and then to return to them as these readers, and what you've done for us to model what it means, right, to be that kind of engaged reader of the world too. So
it's really special to be here tonight, and I appreciate all of you joining us and all of you in the audience. And I hope that I'll be able to cross paths with you readers in some way, but feel free if you have more that you wanted to ask, or if after you get the book, you have a question. My website is just my name, megandowdlambert.com, and you can send me an email, or I'm not on a lot of social media. I'm on Facebook occasionally, but the website's probably the best way to find me. And find EmbraceRace. They do incredible, inspiring work that gives me hope for the world. That's what I said in the acknowledgements. Did you read that, you guys? You're in there.
Yeah.
And
the
Horn book.
Yeah,
subscribe to the Horn book. They do incredible work. Go to the Carle. A love fest here tonight. So thank you all. This was so wonderful for me.
Congratulations,
wonderful essays, Megan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Goodbye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.